So in the spirit of intersection, and in talking with Milan before the event, as you can see, I've got an intersection title, a bit obvious, that enterprise design meets enterprise investment. Now, the bit of enterprise design that I tend to focus on is called enterprise architecture. That's not the entirety, of course, of enterprise design. So that will crop up in the conversation. So here we go. Now, what I'm going to do is use 5 design principles in order to solve a particular challenge that some of us face, which is that enterprises don't often see the benefit of investing in design. So, as we are enterprise designers, the challenge we face, if we face that challenge, is to actually do exactly what we've been talking about in these 2 days. I'm just going to borrow Christoph's new principle from his presentation, some of which you saw beforehand, which I'm going to call a Nesquik principle. Now, those of us here for the last presentation, he said something like this. So, Christoph, if I change your words, it was not on purpose. If you ask me to tell you what I value about Nesquik, can't do it. What I need to do is describe my breakfast, and then I can tell you about where Nesquik fits in terms of value in my breakfast. So, in valuing enterprise design, what we have to do is give people a context, a story, in which we then value enterprise design. Otherwise, we're going to be trying to get them to value design as a single product, like Nesquik. So my 5 principles are there. I have the great benefit of working with people all around the world on strategies for what is now called enterprise investment, and that is the convergence of enterprise architecture and investment portfolio management. So far, since I had a real job once upon a time. I left my last real job in 2000. I've had my feet on the ground in 26 countries, sorry. And that matters to me, because what I want to learn by working with people are the similarities and differences when it comes to sorts of subjects that I care about and we care about. So it's not that's sort of a metric I'm aiming at. It's just taking note of how far I've got, which is not very far in terms of the world as a whole, but I'm getting somewhere in terms of getting a sense of diversity as well as similarity. And I'm also the author of a book, 3 books, 3 business novels, which form a trilogy. And actually, the first one is about how you turn information technology strategy into a strategy for investing in change. The second one is how you turn something called enterprise architecture into enterprise architecture. It's called recreation. And the third one is how you turn all of that into an investment portfolio that delivers your goals as an enterprise as efficiently as you possibly can. Each is narrated by a different person. That's one by a CIO, that's by an enterprise architect, and the last one by a chief executive. So that's what I want to say about that. You didn't want to come and hear about books, but that's one of the things I've done along the way. Now, what I need to do is get back to my breakfast, talk about Nesquik principles. I had a cup of coffee somewhere in Paris this morning for breakfast. I could have stayed in the hotel. And this is about experiences. I'm just going to share my breakfast experience with you. Now, I could have easily stayed in the hotel, nice dining room, 15 euros for breakfast. All I wanted is a coffee and a croissant. So I went for a walk. It was early, conference starts at 10, so I went for a walk. There is my coffee. Okay, you may or may not already know that that's not Starbucks, nothing wrong with Starbucks, but I'm in Paris and I wanted to have some sort of Parisian coffee experience. By the time I remembered to take this picture, I'd half eaten my croissant. So I didn't want to sort of get you to join me in that experience by showing you a half-eaten croissant, so it's just the coffee, okay? And that's what I could see in front of me. You think, well, what are you doing? Sitting in Paris looking at what looks like a building site. Okay, I wasn't the only 2-legged organism there having breakfast. There were some pigeons. Now, it's very important from a point of view of ecosystems because, for example, where I come from, in England, we have massive seagulls, this big, when they've got the wings out, that come and steal your food while you're walking down the road. And so you've got to be conscious about your relationship here with the ecosystem, because there's some other 2-legged creatures having breakfast just nearby. Now, it wasn't the only thing I could see. I could actually see that. So I was indeed by the Centre Georges Pompidou. And I brought that up because not only because I wanted to talk about breakfast and pigeons and things, but because Centre Georges Pompidou, I understand now, is the most visited building in Europe. Exactly. I'm looking at your face. I read that. It must be true. I read it on the internet. There was nobody there at the time because it was closed, apart from me and my coffee and the pigeons. But there it is. There's a Centre Georges Pompidou. And why that's particularly important for what we're talking about is because the architects, Richard Rogers, Renzo Piano, and the other guy that we generally don't mention is another guy, Gianfranco. So you read it different places, you get 2 architects or 3, but there was 3. Okay, their concept was actually an inside-out architecture. And therefore, when you look at it from different angles, that's what must be the back. Of course, you get the services on the outside, so that the inside space is cleared for all the things they want to do on the inside. So there is a services-oriented architecture. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what we want. And in this case, we know who designed it. Well, at least two of them. Usually two of them are mentioned, Richard Rogers, Renzo Piano, and then there's Gianfranco. Now, in London now, if you go to the certain point in the Thames, you can see the Shard, which was designed by Renzo Piano, and you can now see the Leadenhall building, designed by Richard Rogers, staring at each other. High buildings across. These guys are taking over the world, you know. It's a world domination scheme, there's no doubt about it. So anyway, that was my breakfast, which links to what I want to talk about next. Because there is, from another angle, I was, of course, sitting down here somewhere, from another angle taken yesterday when it was busy, the Centre Georges Pompidou. Now, that was chosen, as often these things are, from a design competition. And there's, in any big work like that, there will be a design competition. And somewhere out there are all the blueprints and diagrams and drawings and presentations for all the things that never actually got realized. Such is the life of a designer or architect. I've spoken to architects, an American architect over in Oslo. I asked him, how often do you actually get your designs realized in practice? He said, 1 in 5 is a really good hit rate. Really 1 in 5. And he happened to mention, which I didn't ask him, he said, do you know, by the way, he said, do you know only 5% of the buildings in North America is designed by an architect? The rest are clearly designed by someone, and they're generally really good buildings that stand up and please people and so on. But actually, the role of the architect in this case is to accept that most times we're not needed, and we have to pitch in for things where we will not be given the job. What I want to start with is this principle. For those of us that do enterprise architecture, involved in enterprise architecture, and indeed business architecture, IT architecture, solutions architecture, and then enterprise design and product design, and we're all designers. Architecture is a form of design. I'm just going to stick to buildings for now, because we're going to get to enterprises later. Of course, building something like this is a huge enterprise. The Pont du Gard in the south of France, near Nîmes, you just have to admire the enterprise that went into building it, as well as the design that was behind it. And it goes all the way back to what the Romans taught us about architecture, which are those 3 Latin words which mean that we're designing an entity which is durable, useful, and beautiful. Now, the difference between perhaps an architect and other designers, as we'll see, is the scale of the attention that they want to pay to something. Okay, it's because there's no doubt that whoever designed that aqueduct bridge, the whole thing, didn't design every little bit of it. But nevertheless, in total, that is what when we do enterprise, business architecture, and so on, we have to be designing durable, useful, and beautiful enterprises. Except most of us don't get to design an entire enterprise ever. Or if it is, it's a little one like mine. Most of us are designing changes to enterprises that we need people to invest in. And when actually you introduced this session a couple of times, the money sort of matters, because you mentioned money. It's actually want people to invest themselves in emotionally in whatever we've designed, the change we've designed, and then the money will follow. All right, it is really a people thing, as we've heard a couple of times today. And nearby, not that far away, is the Viaduct de Millau. And actually gets to the point where you start to see that design is a collaborative thing. So we have Norman Foster in this case is the architect. The engineer, French Michel Vitago, is actually the person who really conceived of the viaduct. And then the builders, Eiffage, are the people who actually realized it in practice. And therefore, what we're looking at how is a web of design, a network of design, in which you have architects, engineers, builders, and so on. And that's what we have to make happen to succeed at enterprise design. So there we are. Architecture is a form of design, and there are some pictures, again, still on buildings for a moment, of that Richard Rogers and his team drew of the Leadenhall building before it was realized in practice. We can sort of talk about what we're all here to talk about, the purpose of something, the context in which it appears, hence Nesquik at breakfast. The constraints are exposed to the self-expression of the investor and the architect and other people. And finally, our ability to realize something in practice. And if there's one frustration that I meet in the world of enterprise architecture and business architecture, and probably in enterprise design, is the realization of our ideas, our designs, in practice. And that's where we get the intersection of enterprise design and enterprise investment. Because you see, for that building to become real, somebody had to invest in it. Those investors choose the design, and again, that would be done from a design competition. If the investor doesn't like the design or the designer, we will not get chosen. Where we have to recognize that enterprises and buildings are in fact completely different media through which to express ourselves is in this. Here I've quite rightly shown you photographs of buildings and drawings of buildings which resemble the building in some way. And we can actually do physical models of physical things. When it comes to expressing our ideas as enterprise designers, we have this gap between the thing we're talking about and our ability to either photograph it, draw it, or physically model it. Every model that we use of an enterprise is a concept that does not resemble the enterprise, because the enterprise itself is a concept. Coca-Cola, we've had that mentioned today, Renault and so on. Essentially the enterprise is a concept we're all invested in, which you cannot realistically draw. But we try. And it's actually in the drawings that we make that we can have either the most or least impact. And one of the drawings that still has a great deal of impact comes from the book Competitive Advantage, Michael Porter. Actually, it's two different designs you see for the cover, same book, different cover, which was written at the same time as Back to the Future came out in 1985. And we're 1 year now from, if you know this, flying cars and hoverboards and things. I'm looking forward to next year. It's going to be great. But it's a kind of long time ago now, 1985. But that's when Michael Porter proposed this model to us. And in one of the later editions of the book, he described it as an architecture. Fair enough. So we have an architectural model. And the reason that's on the screen is because that's, even if people don't know Michael Porter's model, in boardrooms and other places around the world, the basic mental model that people are using to design their enterprise. So they design it around a value chain which has primary activities here and support activities. See, I didn't get that. It must be a suspension bridge or something. The support activities are at the top. I don't know, but never mind. That's how Michael drew it. They're overheads, but they're supportive overheads, so they're not just overheads. Anyway, never mind. But so that is still the way in which people think of an enterprise when they come to design it. And the challenge is always going to be for people like designers and architects, say, so where do we fit in Michael Porter's model? In fact, where does change, investing in change, fit in Michael Porter's model? It kind of doesn't show explicitly, anyway. So where we end ourselves up in probably in technology development or something like that, and trying to do all this from being in IT or somewhere. So what I'm going to say is, for various purposes, that model is ideal, which is why we still use it. But we have to bear in mind that if people are designing enterprises like that, to understand the value of investing in design, it's not giving them the context, like the Nesquik principle, the breakfast, in which to really understand what design brings to the party when they've got that model in their heads. At the heart of every enterprise design, for my mind, is this model. Whether we use Michael Porter's model or any other, we can draw whatever model we like, because there's no realistic model of an enterprise in which people produce value using money and technologies. And what we're trying to do is there's a green box, the sunlight almost conceals it here. We're trying to find concepts, constructs, in which we can sort of wrap together people, money and technologies, money, technologies and people, whichever way you want to do it, in order to achieve the value that you want to achieve. Now, the other thing that has cropped up in recent years is that the people using technologies and money that we need to focus on as we design enterprises, people are used to thinking about employees. Well, that's true. But actually, the people now we have to focus on are consumers and competitors and regulators. People outside the the span of a traditional view of the boardroom as to who these people are, who are using their own technologies and their own money to make or break our enterprise. So of course, the last 2 days we've been talking about designing enterprises for the experiences of consumers in particular. There's also investors and politicians and regulators and other people, because they're now the people using their money and their technologies to make or break our enterprise. And that's still a new message for many boardrooms. Employees still important, but it's actually now consumer and other people outside we need to be thinking of. The next thing is, because enterprises are made up of enterprising people, then that's my next principle. that enterprises constantly redesign themselves. Some are really, really good at it, in which case the value of bringing more design to the party might be very minimal. Some we know are still really, really bad at it, and while they still survive, which might be some years yet, there is a lot of value in bringing design and architecture to the party. But it has to recognize the culture and the process and the disciplines in which the enterprise is constantly redesigning itself. That's the context, that's the breakfast in which we need to appear. So one of the big push at the moment for enterprises redesigning themselves is indeed outside in, and it's coming from the perfect storm, as people call it, of consumerization plus cloud. So people focus on the technology aspects of this. That's a useful thing to focus on. But actually consumerization is more about what we people are doing using various technologies. And cloud, they tend to focus on cloud computing, but actually we can actually describe our enterprise as being made up of a cloud organization and so on. So more about that in a minute. And that headline, by the way, was a bit parochial for CIOs, as if it was only them having trouble. We consumers are having tough choices because of consumerization plus cloud, let alone CIOs and other people. And actually to help us with those choices is one of the design principles we might want to adopt. Let's help consumers with their difficult choices choose us. And you can see companies really good at that already. I could name a few. For me personally, my bank in the UK is Barclays. That's not an advertisement, Barclays. But they have somehow helped me with the difficulties that come with consumerization to make my banking life easier, which makes other aspects of my life a bit easier. In the middle of it, of course, is the enterprise, your enterprise, the enterprise you want to design. And there are pressures, of course, strategic pressures, not just operational pressures, coming in saying, so what do you want to do about these things? We've got George Clooney and Mark Wahlberg, the perfect storm of forces coming in on your ship. And what do you want to do about it? So strategically, there are some big questions, which we designers and architects are there to help with, because we understand the context and everything else, to say, you can't just sort of redesign the value chain you currently have, perhaps. You have to rethink our role in the market now the market has changed. And the other way around is these two forces are pulling things out of our enterprise that we used to like and control. So choices, processes, being pulled out by consumers, pulled out by suppliers. Control being taken away from us. Can you imagine now that your enterprise is staring at their IT budgets, trying to see the value they get from the money being spent on IT. And then we have to remind them that the value being spent on IT that delivers value to our business is the consumer's money, not ours. And you start to see where this is taking people in terms of their acceptance or rejection of what's going on in the market. And then you've got people down here, suppliers, saying, we don't want to be IT suppliers forever, we want to be film suppliers or music suppliers or financial transaction suppliers. So working with enterprises around Europe, there's 3 I've been working with who do financial transactions, they are running the scenario in which we have to redesign our enterprise completely in case the people over in the west coast of the USA take over the processing financial transactions and we won't get to do it anymore. So radical redesign of what your enterprise is for, because the IT people don't want to be the IT people anymore. So the combination of consumerization and cloud, push and pull, is reframing the context in which enterprise architecture and enterprise design can really make a difference. Ultimately, as we've seen with some, Blockbuster Video comes to mind, a great enterprise that then wasn't great anymore, and then wasn't anymore. We can go around entire enterprises now with the combination of consumerization and cloud. So again, in scenario thinking and scenario design, how do we make sure people don't go around us is one of the key architectural questions we're considering at the moment. So with all of that, and with the idea that, or the principle that we can't draw or physically model, realistically draw, physically model, photograph an enterprise, let's take a careful look at how some people are modeling enterprises to make sure we're ready for this world we're in. We're actually articulating the world we're in. Because if, for example, the wrong model is being plugged into people's investments, people's thoughts as they lie in a bath somewhere about what to do next, then it's quite likely that people are investing in a design that will lead them into the wrong space. So, for example, there is a model. I'm not going to tell you it's the right model yet. I'm going to tell you it's the wrong model in a minute. There is a model of how people can model an enterprise, in which we are a business, we have an architecture, and we have some processes, we have an architecture and knowledge and technologies and so on. And I'm just going to tell you, for the purposes of what I'm going to talk about, we don't want people modeling the enterprise like that. We want people to model the enterprise like this, not finished. So there we are. We are in some sort of ecosystem together with other enterprises and people and other organisms, which we'll call a market if you're commercial. We have to call it something else if you're a government organization. And we don't actually exist at the moment in this picture, whoever we are. We know there are people we'd like to be our customers, going through some experiences in life, having breakfast, traveling, sitting in conferences, whatever. And here we've got some partners and suppliers that we could intervene between the two. And we know the market has some processes. We know the market has some knowledge. We know the market uses technologies. And already we are a long way in a sort of little bit of adjustment to the original model from the sorts of models people are in danger of using to try and make sense of today's world in their boardrooms and their investments. But we need to slide ourselves back in like that and actually look at what do we mean then by business architecture when the market has the processes, the market has the technologies, the market has the knowledge. And we'll go back to some things we have been bound to talk about. And I'm glad we did these couple of days. Our brands, our service, and our products and services, and how they all come together in some coherent appearance in people's experiences. And it's coherency that designers and architects are particularly good at bringing to the party. Where enterprises are constantly redesigning themselves for whatever reason, it will fragment. All the way back to yesterday's opening keynote and Diane at the back, is we can do this by accident or we can do this by design. But where we see people do it either by design or with the wrong model, by accident or with the wrong model, you get a fragmented experience as a customer of people's marketing, sales, service, operations, and everything else. So the art of what we're talking about is to bring these things together, which, if you'll notice, that Michael Porter's value chain separates out. So we are now somewhat in contention with a value chain that works for one reason and doesn't work for another. And then below the line, below here, see we've got an organization drawn as a cloud. I'll tell you why it's drawn as a cloud, because as a customer of this organization, I don't care whether you actually exist. I don't care about your internal design. I don't care which bits you've outsourced or insourced. Don't tell me, don't let me know, I don't care. As soon as you get me caring about that, well, as somebody who knows how to do this, I'll tear you apart. Organizations that expose to me as their customer, their internal divisions, if I'm good at this, I'll tear you apart. Okay? It's not just a comfort factor. They're very vulnerable to me as a strategist who knows how this works, to actually getting much more out of them than they wanted to give me because they're exposing their internal divisions. So while the Porter value chain, again, we have to do what it says in some way to partition off into different spaces the activities that the organization does. When it comes to the customer, we have to create it like a cloud. And I was echoing a presentation from, I think, late this morning, where design might be inside or outside or both. All right? And our art is and architecture the same. Our art is to, like anything else that we depend upon, to have a good mix of internal and external design, architecture, and so on. It's part of the cloud. So you get organizations now looking at things like capability networks as an alternative design to departments. We have other concepts. There's circles and there's pods and so on. But they're all actually a contradiction, if you like, to Michael Porter's value chain. They're all in competition with each other, but they are a recognition that we should perhaps organize around different things than that original value chain suggested we did. And that particular picture, which comes from Recreation, is an experiences-oriented virtual enterprise, as opposed to, for example, a services-oriented something enterprise, which is would be a different picture. And that's the one I've invested myself in, if you like. It's in a book, it's in articles, it's in presentations, as the one I work with people on, and for the reasons I've just explained. And I think the power of a picture, if you're in a boardroom like we sometimes do, we put a picture on the screen and everyone goes, oh yeah, that's right. We hope it's right, because if they give us permission to go away and build a picture that when we actually build it, it doesn't really work, well, that's because we had the responsibility of putting up a picture that worked. And many people in boardrooms will go, yeah, that's right, to things they don't understand. Okay, and we have to make sure that we are the people putting up the right picture. The third principle is that value comes from enterprise investment, not, for example, from capital investment. So there's no doubt, to achieve something in life that we value, we're going to have to reach for some capital, knowledge capital, financial capital, physical capital, but the capital itself does not deliver the value. It's our enterprise as people that we're investing in that delivers the value. When we talk about enterprise design, that's really what we're talking about. We're not talking about capital design, which finance people are good at and other people are good at. IT people are good at. Talking about enterprise design. And that gets us onto this observation from Cranfield University, that 70% of projects in enterprises still fail. That's 70% of change projects, I should say. Now, that's news. I don't know if it's good news or bad news. I put it on a red background because it feels like bad news to people. But actually, has anyone seen The Lone Ranger? Yes, a Disney project, Disney Pictures. Disney Pictures is a business, by the way. The Lone Ranger was a project, an investment. And it's last time I looked, you can't see that very well, it lost $120 million. Okay, so did that fail? I guess if you wanted to get money back from making a film called The Lone Ranger, you have failed. And there are other films released last year. RAPD lost 115 million, Jack the Giant Slayer 101 million, and at the beginning of this year, to top it all, 47 Ronin, minus $150 million. So it's not just change projects that fail. A good proportion of investments in anything fail, which is why we do investment portfolio management. We do investment portfolio management because while we invest in things we think are going to work, we accept that up to a certain percentage will fail, so the portfolio has to cover off those that fail at the same time as giving us ones that work. Were you to have invested in Despicable Me 2, at last count, earlier in the year, it had made $919 million, which if that was your portfolio, I think you're ahead. So we don't mind the ones that fail, as long as we've got enough that succeed, and we're still, they're not all by Disney, but if you were all by the same studios, that we think, well, actually, we win it on that one. So, not surprisingly, when we look at investments in change, they don't all work. They might be really nicely designed, all right, and so on, but somehow they didn't work. And that's just a fact. There's a value chain that makes investments work, investments in change in particular. So what I want you to bear in mind is it's not the opposite, the alternative, the rejection of the Porter value chain. It is an overlay of a different perspective on an enterprise. Michael Porter's picture, Michael Porter's concept, was an activities-oriented architecture. And he took something which people generally find very tangible, discrete activities that people do, and showed how you carve them up to create an enterprise from primary and support activities. The key thing there is tangible. Why it's such a popular way of looking at life is because we can see people doing marketing in our heads. We can see people doing operations. We can sort of put that in a box and call it operations. And we're describing something that's very tangible. Now, what we're going to talk about now are things that are less tangible, but still need to work. We're going to talk about capabilities, which are pervasive to an enterprise. So strategy is not something that strategy people do on their own. It's pervasive to an enterprise. And how you create value with a strategy is you invest in people's enterprise. And if we're talking about an enterprise, an entity, we're investing in some kind of structure that we put people's enterprise in to create the value that we want. And as we're going through life as an enterprise, we're going to invest in changing that structure with a redesigned structure, or we'll just make some investments that deliver more value from the same structure. But that's how a strategy delivers value. And in terms of where we fit, which wasn't evident at all from Michael Porter's value chain, beginning to get a sense of where we fit, we can explain to other people like Neswick and the breakfast principle. Underneath that, there has to be some really great sourcing of people, services, and products, and underneath that, a really great supply. And so enterprise architecture and all its related disciplines is the bit that delivers you your structure. And investment portfolio management is the bit that harnesses all these ideas for change into an investment portfolio that delivers your goals as efficiently as you can. And in many enterprises, their value chain looks like that. Okay, so imagine this, somebody's lying alone in the bath, probably alone, thinking, ooh, SAP, and nothing wrong with SAP, by the way. But we've just product and supplier. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that product, that supplier, believe me. But it's the gap between, and then they go and talk to SAP, which is good. Except that, sometime later, and this may be the experience of SAP and others too, is people say, I'm not quite sure the value we ever got from investing in that SAP thing. Yeah, but that's because you were supposed to do this bit, in which that appeared as a product and a supplier to invest in, and which you would have got the value, or you knew why not. Like Despicable Me 2, you got the value, or RIPD, you didn't, you'd know why not. But if we are trying to do enterprise design, enterprise architecture, and so on, in the absence of the bit that brings them all together, then of course it's really difficult to articulate the value of what we do. So in this case, it is actually enterprise architecture meets enterprise investment, investment portfolio management. But design is an architectural thing. Architects do design. Lots of other people do design. And that's what I mean by the thing on the left. So there is an alternative value chain, which explains at least how strategy delivers value. It actually accepts that there is a cloud here. It's because it's cloud-shaped of internal, external supply of things. That's good too. And explains what we all need to be good at to be successful as we go forward, to complement the activities-oriented value chain that Michael Porter gave us. If we look a bit more detail, this is where it starts to get particularly interesting, for me at least, because I'm going to take us towards investment culture. And the challenge we face is probably going to be about the design of the investment process and the portfolio that goes with it, and the design of the investment culture. And our challenge to get people to really value the design work we do may start with redesigning the investment culture. So there's enterprise investment expanded. We'd want to turn our goals into actual outcomes. And we're going to recognize that most of our outcomes will come from the investments we've already made. So today's operations, which we want to keep stable, but some of our outcomes will have to come from change and innovations. So of course we're going to invest in stability and invest in change. And then we find ourselves faced with agents of stability and agents of change. And now we get towards a more cultural view of life, in which, you know, if the design requires a change, somewhere over here, somebody might not want the change. And they might be right, or they might be wrong. But nevertheless, the opposites are people who are agents of change and agents of stability. Actually, as an enterprise investment person, I'm neutral. I want to find the very best way of achieving our goals as efficiently as I can. But if you're in one of these or the other one, you are going to find yourself being offset by the existing culture, or the change culture. And then we turn all that into outcomes, and that's how it works. Perfect. From a boardroom perspective, many people are still very nervous about investing in innovation, investing in change. And it's because of this. It's because they feel that there's a certain amount of predictability to investing in operations. If you like, if I tip this resource in, I can be fairly predictable about what's going to come out. Every time we start investing in change, we try and apply the same sort of predictability to it, only to find it's based on probabilities instead. That actually in tipping these resources in, it's only probable, and sometimes not much, that we're going to get the result out, like in a movie or something that we wanted. So that makes boards really uncomfortable if they are kind of feeling that we should be predictable. And actually why you see some people with their culture and their process for investing in change trying to turn it to something based on predictability rather than probability. So with that picture in mind, let me tell you about this. Culture has a big impact on design and investment. Now, Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Quite right. Probably not sitting in front of the Pompidou Center or somewhere, but culture eats strategy for breakfast is his statement, and that's true. So in designing something you want the enterprise to do, we're going to have to bear in mind it will be eaten by the culture. That's our design. That when the culture eats it, it will work. So let's have a look. If we look at investment culture, it's centered on value creation of some kind for somebody somewhere. And if we spread that out as various dimensions of investment culture, then we can start looking at why things are going right and why things are going wrong. For example, if we have an innovation focus in our company that's focused out in the market, but when we actually look at our investment portfolio, it seems to be all internal, then there's some paradox in our investment culture apparently, and we're not going to get the results we wanted. If we take the idea that our whole investment portfolio is about delivering value, but our project management is on time, cost, quality, again, we'll realize why things don't work around here. When it comes to it, the analysis of investment culture doesn't look like that. That's a depiction of it for you. But actually, there's all these things interrelated, which are signals of investment culture, which we are probably going to have to redesign for our bit to work. If you compare investment cultures, here is a more table version of it, using a form I use. This is from 25, anonymous, but real people, CIOs, COOs, and CFOs in Norway. who asked me to run a workshop for them on investment culture. And what we're looking at here is what they were saying, because that's all of their answers on the page you see, about the predominant culture in the room when they're actually coming from 25 different enterprises. And what a couple I want to point out to you is when they looked at their innovation focus, it seemed to be pretty healthy from their perspective, that we got a mix, balance between innovating in a market and innovating internally, not too much innovating technically for its own sake. When they looked at then their investment portfolio, all they had was a list. Now, if you want to design a coherent enterprise with change, and your projects are just a list, the chances of achieving your goals efficiently is now very, very low. Okay, so from having the right kind of innovation focus, we now have a fairly immature, badly designed portfolio, and down here, project management was mainly focused on time, cost, quality, or delivering change. So if design is something we value, and design is in the criteria for what we want out of a project, but actually the project manager is doing time, cost, quality, we are in great danger of design fizzling out through a project together with architecture and other things, because it's not in the project manager's interest to deliver it. So my challenge, and the challenge I want to suggest to you, is part of the proof of the value of enterprise design is designing how the enterprise invests in design itself. If it's not very good at investing in design, then all the work we do will fizzle out because of the process and the culture in the enterprise. So what I'm just going to show you is the process by which ideas that people have in the bath or the shower or the car or sitting in a room somewhere turn into the value we want, whatever the value is. Called the enterprise investment process, in which we turn an idea into an innovation to explain who's got to change their behavior, why would they do that, and how much will that cost, and so on, to then decide whether to invest the enterprise, including its money, but not just its money. In fact, it's energy, its emotions in this idea, to then execute on the idea and exploit it to deliver the value. And beg the question is, who do designers work for then? Because you see, the investor's perspective on the process is that at some point we get to sort of build a building, and that's a sourcing and supply issue. As an investor, I quite like the building now, but I know I'm going to have to wait. Whereas the implementer's perspective is, obviously they're all about building buildings, so that's how the process looks like to them. My observation from working with people, particularly enterprise architects, is that quite often we seem to end up working for the implementers. Trying to represent the interests of the investors, but actually we're working for the implementers. I can tell you, Richard Rogers works for the investors, Norman Foster works for the investors, Frank Gehry works for the investors, designers work for the investors. And then, of course, the implementers have their designers, and that's cool too. So, you know, the engineers and the builders have their designers, but they must be being driven by the design we've invested in at the top. Then what I want to do is add in the elements of the actual process that we need to make sure are working. So, for example, we've got a model that people are using in their baths. So when they have an idea, they fit it into a model, which is always going to be unrealistic, but it's based on some thinking. And if we haven't done anything in terms of influence, then everything they do from that moment on will be influenced by that model. Let's say we want them to be influenced by that model. Now we know where to put it, in their heads in the bath. Otherwise, from that moment on, we're going to be delivering the wrong model. So if we have a design, which we've talked about these last 2 days, for how an enterprise needs to think about the world and act on those thoughts, if they're not metaphorically in people's heads in the baths, having breakfast in a square or somewhere, then they will probably not come to fruition. And then we look at the way in which people propose investments to each other and make sure that's consistent with what we want to do. We look at the way in which an investments board chooses investments and deselects investments if they don't work, and so on. Then we look at actually the things that people have to tell the investments board, make sure they're right. Things like that. What's the preferred solution we're going with? What's the impact of that solution on enterprise design? And what likelihood is it's going to work? As designers, we want to make sure that's in the process. If it's not in the process, then design will fizzle out. Underneath the covers, we need an investment portfolio that inherits the design principles that are now beginning to pepper this page to make sure it's coherent. And then out the other end, along the way, we have to be aware of the investment culture. If the people delivering projects don't care about design, then at some point it will fizzle out. Okay, so we have to probably redesign the investment culture so that what comes out the other end, as well as whatever tangible value people they get, is the design that we meant in the beginning. So the real point of this presentation is that while we think about designing enterprises, quite rightly, for what's going on in markets, the challenge we face is potentially redesigning the way it invests in change, both in terms of a process and a culture, to value what we do. So that is enterprise design meets enterprise investment. Okay, the 5 principles at some speed that I've used today are the 5 principles I would commend to you, like that. That really is all I wanted to say, and I hope you've got some questions and some challenges for me if we've got time. Thank you very much.